In the summer of 1942, the Pacific Ocean had become humanity's largest battlefield, stretching across millions of square miles of open water where empires clashed for supremacy. The Imperial Japanese Navy, riding high on 6 months of unprecedented victories from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, seemed invincible. Their warships had swept aside every Allied force they encountered, their aircraft had sunk the pride of the British Navy, and their armies had conquered an empire stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands. Yet on a humid morning in August 1942, everything would begin to change in the waters around a malaria-infested island that most Americans had never heard of, Guadalcanal. The Solomon Islands chain stretched like a double row of emerald stepping stones across the Coral Sea, pointing directly at the vital sea lanes between America and Australia. When Japanese construction troops began clearing jungle to build an airfield on Guadalcanal in July 1942, alarm bells rang from Melbourne to Washington. An operational Japanese airbase there would threaten the lifeline keeping Australia in the war. More critically, it would provide Japan with a springboard for further expansion southward, potentially isolating Australia and forcing it to seek terms. The American response came with unprecedented speed. Operation Watchtower, hastily planned and desperately executed, would become the first American offensive of the Pacific War. On the 7th of August 1942, the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore on Guadalcanal and the nearby islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. They caught the Japanese by complete surprise, seizing the nearly completed airfield within 48 hours. The Marines renamed it Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. This rough strip of crushed coral, barely suitable for operations, would become the most valuable piece of real estate in the South Pacific. But taking the airfield was only the beginning. Holding it would require control of the surrounding waters, and here the Imperial Japanese Navy held every advantage. Their ships were newer, their crews more experienced, their tactics refined through years of preparation. Most crucially, they possessed 2 weapons the Americans had gravely underestimated: the Type 90, 3 long-lance torpedo, with its massive warhead and extraordinary range, and an officer corps trained to perfection in the art of night combat. The Japanese had spent years preparing for night battles, drilling their lookouts until they could spot ships in darkness that would blind American radar operators, practicing torpedo runs until their destroyer crews could launch spreads with lethal precision. The stage was set for a series of naval battles that would determine not just the fate of Guadalcanal, but the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. Over the next 4 months, these waters would witness some of the most savage naval combat in history. Ships would burn like torches in the tropical night, illuminating scenes of unimaginable carnage. Thousands of sailors would perish in waters so thick with sunken vessels that they would earn a new name, Ironbottom Sound. The battles would test every aspect of naval warfare: carrier aviation, surface gunnery, torpedo tactics, damage control, and above all, the courage of the men who fought them. What emerged from this crucible would reshape naval warfare forever. The United States Navy would learn, adapt, and eventually master the art of night combat. Radar would evolve from a promising technology to a war-winning weapon. New tactics would emerge, written in blood and tested in fire. Most importantly, these battles would mark the point where the tide of Japanese expansion finally broke and began its long, inexorable retreat toward Tokyo Bay. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa received the news of the American landings while at his headquarters in Rabaul on the morning of the 7th of August, 1942. The 53-year-old commander of the newly formed 8th Fleet understood immediately what was at stake. Without hesitation, he began gathering every available warship for an immediate counterstrike. By evening, he had assembled a striking force of 5 heavy cruisers: Chokai, his flagship, Aoba, Kako, Kinugasa, and Furutaka, along with the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari and the destroyer Unagi. It was not a large force, but Mikawa knew that in night combat, skill mattered more than numbers. The Allied naval forces protecting the invasion fleet were divided into 3 groups. The Southern Force, under British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, guarded the channel between Savo Island and Cape Esperance with the heavy cruisers HMAS Australia, HMAS Canberra, and USS Chicago, plus destroyers. The Northern Force, commanded by Captain Frederick Reefcole, covered the passage between Savo and Florida Islands with the heavy cruisers USS Vincennes, USS Quincy, and USS Astoria. Two destroyers, USS Blue and USS Ralph Talbot, patrolled west of Savo as radar pickets. The arrangement looked formidable on paper, but it suffered from fatal flaws: divided command, lack of coordination, and above all, dangerous overconfidence. Mikawa's force raced south through the slot between the parallel chains of the Solomons on August 8, using the islands to mask their approach. Though spotted by Allied reconnaissance aircraft, the reports were misinterpreted and delayed. As darkness fell, Mikawa's column approached Savo Island at 26 knots, every man at battle stations, lookouts straining into the tropical darkness. At 12:43 a.m. on August 9, Japanese lookouts spotted the destroyer Blue at 9,000 yards. The American destroyer's radar was operating, but her crew never detected the Japanese column sliding past in the darkness. Mikawa had achieved complete surprise. What followed was less a battle than an execution. At 1:38 a.m., Mikawa's ships launched their long-lance torpedoes and opened fire with their guns. The southern force was caught completely off guard. HMAS Canberra took 2 torpedo hits and dozens of shell strikes within minutes. Her captain was killed, her engines dead, and she burned fiercely in the darkness. USS Chicago took a torpedo in her bow and turned away from the battle, her captain never alerting the northern force to the danger bearing down on them. Mikawa's column swept around Savo Island like a scythe, catching the northern force in the same state of fatal unpreparedness. USS Astoria's gunnery officer actually ordered his gun crews to cease fire, believing they were shooting at friendly ships, before Japanese searchlights illuminated his ship and shells began tearing her apart. USS Quincy's captain, awakening to find his ship under attack, made a gallant attempt to fight back, but his ship was caught in a crossfire between multiple Japanese cruisers. Within minutes, Quincy was a burning wreck. USS Vincennes suffered a similar fate, hit by at least 56 shells and 6 torpedoes. In 33 minutes of combat, Mikawa had achieved one of the most lopsided victories in naval history. 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sinking or fatally damaged. Over 1,000 Allied sailors were dead or dying. Japanese losses amounted to minor damage to 3 cruisers and fewer than 60 casualties. Yet at the moment of his greatest triumph, Mikawa made the decision that would haunt Japanese strategists for the rest of the war. Fearing air attack from American carriers he believed were nearby, he ordered his force to withdraw without attacking the defenseless transport fleet. Those transports carried the supplies and reinforcements that would enable the Marines to hold Henderson Field. Mikawa had won the battle but failed to achieve the strategic victory that might have changed everything. The Battle of Savo Island sent shockwaves through the U.S. Navy. It was their worst defeat in a fair fight in their entire history. The disaster exposed every weakness in American naval doctrine: poor communications, inadequate night training, over-reliance on technology, and dangerous assumptions about Japanese capabilities. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of the amphibious force, called it a terrible reverse. The Marines on Guadalcanal, watching the transport fleet withdraw with much of their supplies still aboard, wondered if they had been abandoned to their fate. The waters around Savo Island, thick with oil and debris from sunken ships, earned their grim new name, Ironbottom Sound. 2 weeks after the disaster at Savo Island, both sides prepared for a major effort to reinforce their forces on Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, understood that the American seizure of Henderson Field threatened Japan's entire position in the South Pacific. He organized Operation Ka, a massive reinforcement convoy protected by the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor, along with the light carrier Ryujo. Against them, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded Task Force 61, built around the carriers USS Saratoga and USS Enterprise, with USS Wasp operating separately. The stage was set for the third carrier battle of the war. The Japanese plan was characteristically complex. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's main carrier force would remain north of the Solomons, while Ryujo operated independently as bait to draw American airstrikes. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka's reinforcement convoy, carrying 1,500 troops of the Ichiki Regiment's second echelon, would slip through to Guadalcanal. The plan required precise timing and assumed the Americans would take the bait. It was a gamble that reflected both Japanese confidence and their increasing desperation to retake Henderson Field. On the 24th of August 1942, the opposing carrier forces groped toward each other across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. American PBY Catalina flying boats found Tanaka's convoy first, prompting Fletcher to launch a strike from Saratoga. But Tanaka, anticipating attack, reversed course and evaded the American aircraft. As the day progressed, both sides launched searches that crisscrossed the Coral Sea, each admiral trying to find his enemy before being found himself. The Americans had one crucial advantage: radar, which allowed them to detect incoming strikes and vector fighters to intercept them. At 9:05 a.m., American search planes found Ryujo operating alone, exactly as the Japanese had planned. Fletcher took the bait, launching a full strike from Saratoga. 38 Dauntless dive bombers and 8 Avenger torpedo bombers found the light carrier and attacked with devastating precision. Ryujo took multiple bomb and torpedo hits, her flight deck shattered, fires raging through her hangar. She sank that evening, taking 121 of her crew with her. But while Saratoga's planes were sinking Ryujo, Nagumo's main force had found Enterprise. The Japanese strike of 27 Valdive bombers and 10 Zero fighters arrived over Task Force 16 at 4:41 p.m. Enterprise twisted and turned under the assault, her anti-aircraft guns filling the sky with fire. But the Japanese pilots pressed home their attacks with characteristic determination. 3 bombs struck home, the third penetrating deep into the ship before exploding, bulging her flight deck and starting serious fires. 35 men died instantly, but Enterprise's damage control teams performed magnificently, extinguishing fires and restoring flight operations even as the battle continued. By evening, she was recovering aircraft despite the gaping hole in her flight deck. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons ended inconclusively. The Japanese had lost Ryujo and 90 aircraft with their irreplaceable crews. The Americans had suffered serious damage to Enterprise, but she remained operational. More importantly, Tanaka's convoy had been forced to retreat, denying the Japanese the reinforcements they desperately needed. The carrier battle had demonstrated a crucial truth. While the Japanese still possessed superior aviation skills, American radar and anti-aircraft defenses were evening the odds. The days of easy Japanese victories were over. The 11th of October 1942 marked a turning point in the Guadalcanal campaign. For 2 months, the U.S. Navy had avoided night combat, ceding control of Ironbottom Sound to the Tokyo Express runs that brought Japanese reinforcements under cover of darkness. But Rear Admiral Norman Scott had spent those weeks drilling his cruisers and destroyers in night fighting techniques. When intelligence reported another Tokyo Express run scheduled for October 11, Scott was ready. He would meet the Japanese at night, on their own terms. Scott's Task Force 64 consisted of the heavy cruisers USS San Francisco and USS Salt Lake City, the light cruisers USS Helena and USS Boise, and 5 destroyers. His battle plan was simple but revolutionary for the U.S. Navy. Fight in column formation, use radar to gain the advantage, and maintain strict fire discipline. As darkness fell on October 11, Scott's column steamed towards Savo Island. Radar operators hunched over their scopes, lookouts straining into the darkness. The Japanese force, commanded by Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto, consisted of 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers, escorting a reinforcement convoy. Goto had made the Tokyo Express run many times without opposition. He was not expecting a fight. This overconfidence would prove fatal. As his force approached Savo Island just before midnight, Helena's new SG radar detected them at 27,700 yards. For the first time in the war, American radar would provide decisive tactical advantage in a night battle. At 11:46 p.m., Scott ordered his column to open fire. The night exploded in violence as American shells crashed into the unsuspecting Japanese formation. Goto's flagship Ioba took 40 shells in the opening minutes, her bridge demolished, Admiral Goto mortally wounded. The destroyer Fubuki disintegrated under concentrated fire from multiple American cruisers. Chaos reigned as ships fired at anything they could see, friend and foe alike. The destroyer USS Duncan, charging ahead of the American line, was hit by both Japanese and American fire. USS Boise, silhouetted by fires, took a shell in her forward magazine that should have destroyed her, but quick flooding saved the ship. The battle lasted just over 30 minutes, but its impact was profound. The Japanese lost the heavy cruiser Furutaka and destroyer Fubuki, with heavy damage to Aoba. American losses were limited to the destroyer Duncan, though Boise required extensive repairs. More importantly, Cape Esperance shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility in night combat. American sailors had faced the enemy in darkness and won. The victory provided a desperately needed morale boost after the disasters of Savo Island. Admiral Scott became a hero, proof that American officers could match Japanese tactical skill. Yet Cape Esperance also revealed continuing problems with American night fighting doctrine. Friendly fire had damaged several ships, communications had broken down repeatedly, and confusion had reigned at critical moments. The Japanese, even when surprised, had fought back with skill and determination. Their long-lance torpedoes remained a deadly threat. The victory was real, but it had come at a price and exposed weaknesses that would need to be addressed. The real test was yet to come. November 1942 brought the Guadalcanal campaign to its climax. Both sides understood that the next major push would likely determine the island's fate. The Japanese assembled their largest reinforcement convoy yet, 11 transports carrying 7,000 troops of the 38th Infantry Division, their equipment and supplies. To ensure their safe arrival, Admiral Yamamoto committed the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, equipped with special fragmentation shells to destroy Henderson Field. The Americans, alerted by intelligence, rushed every available ship to the area. The stage was set for the most decisive naval battle of the campaign. The battle began on November 12, when Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's Task Force 67 intercepted Admiral Hiroaki Abe's bombardment force approaching Savo Island. Callahan commanded 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers against 2 Japanese battleships, 1 light cruiser, and 14 destroyers. The Americans had radar, but Callahan, inexplicably, chose to fight in a single column rather than deploying for maximum advantage. As the forces closed in the darkness, discipline collapsed on both sides. At 1:48 a.m. on November 13, the battle erupted in a point-blank melee. Ships fired at any target they could see, often unsure if they were friend or foe. The destroyer USS Cushing, leading the American column, found herself between 2 Japanese forces and was torn apart. USS Laffey charged the battleship Hai at such close range that the battleship's main guns couldn't depress enough to hit her, but Japanese secondary batteries reduced the destroyer to a burning wreck. Admiral Callahan and his staff were killed when Japanese shells destroyed San Francisco's bridge. Admiral Scott, the hero of Cape Esperance, died when Japanese shells tore through USS Atlanta's bridge. The battleship Hiei, hit by over 80 shells, staggered from the battle with her steering damaged and superstructure wrecked. Dawn found her circling helplessly north of Savo Island, where American aircraft from Henderson Field and Enterprise finished her off. She was the first Japanese battleship lost in the war. But American losses were severe. The light cruisers Atlanta and Juno, destroyers Cushing, Laffey, Barton, and Monson all went down. The battle had been a tactical draw but a strategic American victory. The Japanese bombardment had been prevented. The Japanese tried again on the night of November 14–15. This time Admiral Willis Ching Lee commanded Task Force 64, built around the modern battleships USS Washington and USS South Dakota. Lee was a gunnery expert who understood radar's potential. When Admiral Nobutake Kondo's bombardment force appeared, Lee was ready. In a battle dominated by technology rather than confusion, Washington's radar-directed 16-inch guns demolished the battleship Kirishima in 7 minutes of devastating fire. Japanese destroyers managed to torpedo 3 American destroyers and damage South Dakota when her electrical systems failed, but the second bombardment mission had failed. The daylight hours of November 14 brought the final act. American aircraft from Henderson Field and Enterprise found Tanaka's transport convoy and attacked relentlessly. 6 transports were sunk outright. The remaining 4 beached themselves on Guadalcanal, where they were destroyed by aircraft and artillery fire. Of the 7,000 troops embarked, fewer than 2,000 reached shore, most without equipment or supplies. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal had cost both sides heavily, but for Japan, the losses were irreplaceable. They would never again attempt a major reinforcement of Guadalcanal. The 30th of November 1942 brought one final humiliation for the U.S. Navy in the waters off Guadalcanal. The Battle of Tassafaronga should have been an easy American victory. Rear Admiral Carlton Wright's Task Force 67, with 5 cruisers and 6 destroyers, intercepted 8 Japanese destroyers under Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, attempting to deliver supplies to Guadalcanal. The Americans had radar, numerical superiority, and complete surprise. What followed was a tactical disaster that demonstrated the Imperial Japanese Navy still possessed lethal skills. Wright's force detected Tanaka's destroyers on radar and opened fire at 11:20 p.m., quickly sinking the destroyer Takanami. But the remaining Japanese destroyers reacted with trained precision, launching spreads of long-lance torpedoes before turning away. The American cruisers, maintaining steady courses to improve their gunfire, sailed directly into the torpedo spreads. USS Minneapolis took 2 torpedoes that tore off her bow. USS New Orleans suffered an even worse fate, a long lance detonating her forward magazines and severing everything forward of turret 2. USS Pensacola took a torpedo that caused massive flooding and fires. USS Northampton, hit by 2 torpedoes, capsized and sank. In exchange for 1 destroyer, Tanaka had crippled 4 American cruisers and sunk 1. It was the most successful Japanese torpedo attack of the war, achieved by destroyers that hadn't even been carrying torpedo reloads to save weight for supply drums. The battle exposed continuing American failures in night combat doctrine. Despite radar advantage, despite numerical superiority, despite achieving surprise, the U.S. Navy had been tactically defeated. Admiral Nimitz's frustration was evident in his assessment. The fortunes of war and the restricted waters in which we were forced to bring the enemy into action caused our ships to suffer considerable loss and damage. Yet Tassafaronga was a tactical victory without strategic consequence. Tanaka's destroyers had failed to deliver their supplies. The Tokyo Express made 3 more runs in December, but submarine and PT boat attacks, combined with airstrikes, meant few supplies reached the starving Japanese garrison. On December 12, the Japanese Navy proposed abandoning Guadalcanal. Despite army resistance, Imperial General Headquarters agreed on December 31 to evacuate all forces from the island. The 6-month battle for Guadalcanal was ending in American victory. The evacuation operation, conducted in early February 1943, was brilliantly executed. The Japanese successfully extracted over 10,000 troops from under American noses, but this success couldn't mask the strategic disaster. Japan had lost 2 battleships, 1 light carrier, 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 12 destroyers, and hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft and aircrew. More critically, they had lost the strategic initiative. Never again would the Imperial Japanese Navy dominate the waters of the South Pacific. The American losses had been severe: 2 fleet carriers damaged, 8 cruisers, and 14 destroyers sunk. But unlike Japan, America could replace these losses and more. New ships were sliding down the ways every week. New aircrew were training by the thousands. New technologies like radar were being refined with each battle. Most importantly, the U.S. Navy had learned how to fight. The mistakes of Savo Island had been paid for in blood, but the lessons had been learned. Night fighting techniques, radar doctrine, damage control procedures, all had been tested and refined in the crucible of Ironbottom Sound. The strategic impact of these naval battles extended far beyond Guadalcanal. They had broken the myth of Japanese invincibility, proving that the Imperial Navy could be defeated even in night combat, their specialty. They had validated the American strategy of island hopping, demonstrating that with control of the sea and air, any Japanese position could be isolated and reduced. Most critically, they had begun the attrition of Japanese naval power, particularly the irreplaceable cadre of trained pilots and experienced destroyer crews who had been the backbone of Japanese tactical superiority. The battles had also transformed naval warfare itself. Radar had evolved from an experimental technology to an essential combat system. The Combat Information Center, developed in response to the confusion of these battles, would become the nerve center of every warship. Damage control techniques, refined under fire, would save dozens of ships in future battles. The integration of carrier aviation with surface forces, tested at Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, would define Pacific naval warfare for the remainder of the conflict. For the men who fought these battles, the memories would last a lifetime. They had faced the Japanese Navy at the height of its power and prevailed. In the darkness off Savo Island, in the carrier duels of the Coral Sea, in the point-blank melees of November, they had written their names in history. Veterans would speak of the waters off Guadalcanal with a mixture of pride and horror, remembering shipmates lost, vessels sunk, but also remembering the moment when the tide of war turned. The Japanese Navy would fight on for 3 more years, but never again with the confidence and skill displayed in 1942. The loss of experienced crews, the destruction of elite units, the exhaustion of resources, all dated from the battles around Guadalcanal. Admiral Tanaka, who had fought so brilliantly at Tassafaronga, later wrote that Guadalcanal was the fork in the road to victory or defeat. His supply runs had earned the grudging admiration of his enemies, but even his skill couldn't overcome the fundamental truth revealed in these battles. Japan had reached the limits of its expansion and begun the long retreat that would end in Tokyo Bay. The American Navy that emerged from Guadalcanal was fundamentally different from the one that had entered those waters in August 1942. It had learned to fight at night, to use radar effectively, to coordinate air and surface forces. More importantly, it had developed the confidence that comes from facing the best the enemy had and prevailing. The battles had been costly, the lessons paid for in blood, but they had forged a navy that would sweep across the Pacific with unstoppable momentum. The road to Tokyo would be long and bloody, but it began in the waters off Guadalcanal, where the Imperial Japanese Navy's dreams of empire finally died. In the years that followed, Ironbottom Sound would become a maritime cemetery, its waters hiding the wrecks of dozens of ships from both nations. Explorers would find these vessels decades later, their guns still pointed at phantom enemies, their bridges still manned by the dead. They remain there today, monuments to one of history's most savage naval campaigns. The battles they fought determined not just the fate of a single island, but the future of the Pacific, the course of World War II, and ultimately the shape of the modern world. In those dark waters off Guadalcanal, the tide of Japanese expansion broke and rolled back, never to return.